the traditional way was to prioritize the brand and to think secondarily about how do you bring on for growth smaller community groups. With the diversity that we're facing into now, the challenges that we have right now, we need to reprioritize and rebalance. And I believe that the primary strategy is, how do you bring on micro-communities?
Welcome to the Cultural Pulse podcast.
Cultural Pulse is a global micro-community tech company supporting organisations to engage micro-communities better.
Each episode will connect you with the pulse of what's actually happening in different micro-communities across Australia and New Zealand and get under the hood of cultural behaviours, perspectives and new experiences.
Stay updated with Cultural Pulse on our website, download our app and subscribe to our social channels.
All right, Dave, it's great to have you in the office, the Cultural Pulse studio now, which the office has turned into the Cultural Pulse.
It looks like a studio now, doesn't it?
With all this lighting.
Hollywood.
Thank you, Raj. Give you a nice little plug there. What's your business name again?
Karmic Artworks.
Thanks to Raj at Karmic Artworks. We've got the Cultural Pulse has been turned into a studio. But I often think, I feel really grateful to have you not only in our office, but even in Australia and having conversations that we having a global marketer with the brain you have, the experience you have to kind of grace the Australian shores and
Reg, enough of the flattery, my friend. Enough of the flattery. Come on.
No, it's a really big thing because then we want to talk about some of these topics that are plaguing the Australian marketing community, and there are some areas that need a little bit of disruption, and we're going to talk about one of those areas today, which is around the concept of micro communities. I've firmly believed that Australia's always been a diverse country. You see that in the Aboriginal languages map. The Indigenous languages map, and communities talk about it all the time. So many different languages, very different cultures, and in the past we've kind of bucketed those cultures into one, and now we've had massive migration waves from the Greeks and the Italians, and then we've had the Asian wave, and then more recent refugee and the South American and African migration waves, and now we've got a very diverse country. So I wanted to kick off talking about this concept of micro-communities and your experience of this term.
I got to start. I mean, thank you, and thank you for having me. Thank you for such a flattering introduction. Most of it undeserved. But let me start. Let me start by giving you my history, my experience of really understanding different cultures and different skin colors and different religions. And I come from a small village in Scotland. My secondary school was 1,600 people. Of the 1,600 people, 1,599 looked like me. We were all very homogeneous white kids in school, Presbyterian church in Scotland. I remember the first day that we had a person of not white skin color join us. He was a kid from Africa. And the teachers were so worried about how he was going to integrate. And the teachers were so worried about any level of bullying or discrimination against him. And it was really interesting because the school embraced him and the kids embraced him as something that was to be revered, something that was different and something that was to be better understood. And it was his unusualness that was really driving that curiosity. I reversed that role when I had my first job. I went to Istanbul. I lectured in Istanbul for 2 years. And it was in the mid-'80s. They'd just opened up the borders. They were allowing foreigners to come in and work in that country. I was in the first wave. So my university, I was one of 8 teachers who was not Turkish. I was one of 8 teachers who wasn't Muslim. I was one of 8 teachers in a university of 12,000 people who wasn't Muslim and wasn't Turkish.
How's your Turkish?
It's actually pretty good, actually. It's actually pretty good. Don't ask me right now because you just put me on the spot. But it's not bad, but you have to learn. And you have to learn because you're the minority and you're the potentially the group that's being discriminated against, whether it's deliberate or negative discrimination or positive discrimination, but you're different. You got to understand difference. So I've been fascinated since my school days, I've been fascinated since my university days and teaching days with the multiculturalism that goes on and what you can learn, the curiosity, both sides of the fence, being in the minority myself, seeing a friend who was in the minority at school. So I've had jobs all around the world. I've been absolutely fascinated by working with different cultures all around the world, different communities all around the world. So I came to Australia. I was running a business for Proctor Gamble. I was looking after Asia Pacific. I was running marketing services across Asia Pacific for Proctor. And I came to Australia and I thought this would be a fantastic place to come. Multicultural hotbed. You have more different varieties of people, skin colors, religions, communities. And I remember my first meeting, or it was one of my first meetings with the Procter & Gamble community. And I was showing them a commercial that we had been running up in the UK that had been working very well for one of the brands. And it happened to be an African UK lady that was in the commercial. She was a real lady, she was being highlighted. And she'd done a great job, the sales had been great behind the commercial, and I showed it to the Australian community here. And they all shook their heads and said, we can't run that in Australia. And I said, what do you mean you can't run that in Australia? They said, we don't have people in Australia who look like that. And I looked around the office, and they were right. There was nobody in the office who wasn't white. And I looked around the community of the advertising agencies that I was working with, and there wasn't one person who was of any ethnicity or any cultural background other than white Celtic. And this was going back, 20 years ago? And I think Australia's come a very, very long way since then of understanding and the integration of the different communities. But marketing has always been a dominated culture and a dominated function of people who come from white Celtic communities. And we have an unconscious bias. And that unconscious bias is unraveling very, very rapidly as we see the value of the diversity across the Australian community.
Is that the case in Asia as well? I mean, you've worked a lot in Asia, and there's a lot of top marketers in the region, based in Singapore, based in, Japan, Korea. And what do you find?
The difficulty in marketing, is you have not enough resource to do what it is that you're required to do. Now, marketers are required to grow businesses. So you have to invest your resource, and that's your people resource, and that's your money resource, to grow the top line of the business. That's what we're employed for as marketers to do. So we have a natural bias to do that, certainly in a traditional way of marketing, to do it for the largest mass community that we can reach. So if you're Singaporean, you understand the Singaporean community best, and you invest your reduced dollars or your limited dollars in serving the Singapore community.
So Singaporean is a good example because there's a majority of Singaporean Chinese and then Tamil, and when I walk through Singapore, I see different ads. It's hyper localized. It's in language. They're targeting for multilinguals. Seems to be quite good. But I guess it's people who are based there and looking at countries overseas as well. I mean, if you're...
And there's an interesting thing about Singapore, and I lived there for a couple of years. And when you actually get to experience what's going on, sometimes it gives you insight into what's different in Singapore than Australia, for example, because the diversity of population in Singapore is probably less so than the Australian community. The Australians got a lot more African communities, African cultures, European cultures dominant. Yeah. So what's different about Singapore and Australia that makes marketing different in both places? Singapore is very small. It's a very small geography, and everybody lives together. So within the same street, within the same community, within the same church community, within the same schooling community, all the different cultures are represented. It's advanced to that stage. It's integrated to that stage. In Australia, we're still very much at a...
Except if you go to Little India.
Except if you go to India. That's only if you want gold. It's only if you want gold, because that's where all the gold is. But in Australia, it's still very geocentric. So, it's pretty easy to reel off the communities and the suburbs and the postcodes where the communities have all lined up. Now, the older the cultural community, the more migration they've made across the communities in Australia, the postcodes in Australia. But the new migrants, where we've had the greatest numbers coming in the recent decades, are still locked into certain geographic communities. So we don't see them as much. We're not aware of them as much. We're not interacting with them as much as you would do in Singapore. And I think that's part of the problem. We always
advise just catch a train out to Parramatta to see, or to Blacktown just to...
I was telling you the story the other day. I took my daughter to Auburn for lunch a couple of weeks ago. And she was astonished. Auburn is a fantastic place. It's a fantastic place to go for lunch. You can eat round the world in 2 streets. And my 14-year-old, she certainly likes to eat. She's curious and she's interested in trying different cuisines. But Auburn's 20 minutes from my home. She was astonished that we were, and she said this to me, the only white people that she saw in a period of about 3 hours wandering around Auburn. Yeah. And she was fascinated by that. And she was fascinated by the choice of food. And actually finding a restaurant for lunch was really difficult because there were too many interesting places to eat.
This is Auburn in Sydney, which is one of the most multicultural councils in the country. Yes. So in terms of marketers, I mean, what's the role of a large marketer these days to be able to reach or even understand this difference and understand consumers and what's happening in Australia? What's your take on that?
It's hard for marketers. It's hard for marketers. We've had so many different impacts on the function and the profession, starting with digitization, which has been a distraction because we've had to embrace technology, we've had to embrace the use of technology, the systematization of CRM, the whole personalization, the whole customer experience piece. We've had to learn how to do that. We've had to learn how to do that on top of the tradition of building brands. And building brands is really what marketers did and what they were always famous for doing. But now we have to do all of these things, not in the limited channels that we had before. When I talk about limited channels, we were limited by what we could do because mainly all we could do it through was television, free to air. We were limited with the distribution network that we had for our goods and services, which was geocentric, which was dominated, if you were in packaged goods, by 2 vendors, Coles and Woolworths. So you were actually pretty limited in what you were able to do and how you were able to do it.
Payless?
There are those areas which marketers had to consider. But now, with digitization, they had to consider a whole bunch of different things to get their heads around. A whole bunch of different choice sets, a whole bunch of different communication pathways to reach their consumer base. But as they were doing that, the cost of doing business, because of the ability of startups and scale-ups to steal your lunch and to compete on channels that were much cheaper for them to compete on, that you weren't aware of as a big traditional manufacturing business, for example, you had to fight on too many different fronts. So the resourcing has contracted. The cost of doing business has contracted, particularly for the traditional big marketing engines. So you have less people, you have less money, but your demand for growth has never been greater than it is right now. Now, your demand for growth is happening because you've got so many different competitive pieces snipping around the edges. And they're not competitive pieces that you can control within the Australian geography anymore. People are buying as much from overseas. People are buying online, people are choosing to buy offline. The choice of brands, the choice of product, the knowledge sets that allow them to access those, the social media platforms that they can access through, the ability of a marketer to control that now is very limited. And they've got less resource to do it with. So they're responsible for growth, but everything's contracting for them. So the difficulty is, what do you do next? Now, what most people do next, in any respect, when there's...
Call you.
I wish. Can we put my number on the screen? What most people do next, when they're under pressure, is they go safe. They go back to their comfort zone. And they go back to their comfort zone, they sit in the comfort zone, they say, this is how it used to work for us. And often that's a really good thing to do because you're going back to your strength base. But if you're going through a transformation like we're seeing in the world, because of digitization, because of the democratization of knowledge, because of the access of channels, you can't go safe, you have to go different. You have to shift your paradigm.
So is it too much to ask of a marketer in this day around, understanding the changing dynamics of this population, the way that it's fragmented in that way, given all those other variables you've just talked about? Is it too much? It sounds like a lot of
Is it too
pressure.
much? Is it too much to ask them to think differently and go after a different?
I mean, it seems like you're dealing with lots of different marketing channels, the digital
Yes.
Marketing automation. I mean, even looking at that MarTech
Yes, sorry.
diagram, which has 8,000.
Yeah, is the job too big now?
Is the job too big? I mean,
is the job too big?
How do you get across it all? And it sounds like it's multi-skilled and
Yes. And I think what we've seen over the last 20 years, because of that, is there's been a growing skill set and a growing specialty set, a growing contribution to a business that really does sit in the marketing communications area. Marketers 20 years ago, the majority of us were responsible for our P&L. We were running mini businesses. Your brand was a mini business. You had all the resourcing. You were a mini CEO on the brand that you were running. The complexity that's been introduced, I think, makes that very hard for today's marketing community to do. And the specialty skills needed by today's marketing community mean that they need to be dedicated against growth, particularly, rather than running a mini business with P&L responsibility. So we've seen, and we track this. We do the CMO 50 every year, and we see.
How many years have you been doing that?
The CMO 50, I think, it's a really good thing that the CMO does, and Nadia Cameron does a fantastic job of doing this. It's been going for 6 years, and we look at the top CMOs in the country, and we ask them 7 or 8 questions to justify why they and their teams should be recognized as the best marketing operators within this country.
So you've done that for a number of years. What have you noticed as
massive.
kind of a pattern over the years?
I was fortunate to start in the inaugural year 6 years ago on the judging panel. And you think in a short 6-year period, you don't see that much variation or change. I think we've seen massive variation and change in terms of what the role of a CMO is. And we're seeing very clearly from 6 years ago where there was kind of like this duality of, do we manage brands? Are we running business? Are we running growth? With the introduction of MarTech, digitization, personalization, use whichever words help you understand it. But over the last 6 years, we've seen a great division of marketers who are responsible for the technical side of marketing, the digital side, the personalization side. Marketers who are working in large data-rich communities. The big banks, in fact, all the banks, the insurance companies, the wagering companies are very good in this space. And marketers who are not as responsible for digital and data because their organizations are not as heavy with data as service organizations can be. I was at one of them 8-9 years ago at Nestle. Kit Kat doesn't have the same level of data generation as a home loan does. So we see a lot of marketers in the community who are there about the communication side and the brand side and building the brand side. But what's emerging now is a group that sits over the top that both groups report into. And whether we could call them chief marketing officers, whether we call them chief growth officers, whether we call them chief customer officers, I don't know what the right term is. But what the shift is causing is, let's be less concerned about who we are and what our brands are. That's always going to be important. But the most important thing right now is, how do we influence consumers to buy us more, to engage with us more, to relate to us more, to be loyal to us more? And that's a much harder task and a much more important task for long-time customer value than it is to do it the way we used to do, which is to say, here's my great brand, come buy it.
So some of the top marketers in terms of, as you see these applications coming in, what are they doing to reach audiences better, consumers more?
I think we have an unconscious bias to market to ourselves. We have an unconscious bias to do the way we always did it and be comfortable with tradition. So we've been through a period of time, and we can see this, where people have become very focused again on brands. There's nothing wrong with that. Brands will always be important. But they've gone back to their heartland and focused really hard on brands to say, here's what we are, let's make a statement about us. We need you to love us, and they've done a lot of really good work there. There's been a lot of thought about what are the communication channels that we can use, and how do we use social media, and how do we engage through all of those things. The piece that's starting to manifest now, though, is how do we understand where we're going to get growth from next? And if you think about where we're going to get growth from next, it's a pretty straightforward game. You only get growth on a business if somebody buys you who's never bought you before. You only get growth on a business if somebody who's buying a bit of you buys more of you. Or if somebody who's been buying you and has left you comes back to you. There's only 3 consumer behavior changes that we need to think about. But
you make it sound so simple.
But if we think about it, there's 22 million individuals that we need to influence in Australia right now to do this. Can I talk about my Trump example?
Yeah, sure.
Because,
over to you, Chase.
Because what you got, Chase? If you think about this in terms of the U.S. election right now, which we're recording this less than a week before the election takes place. But if you think about the way that Trump does marketing, and he's a brilliant traditional brand marketer. He's identified his base, which is uneducated, white. I'm saying uneducated. I'm saying I could get a lot of trouble for uneducated. I'm talking about white American males who don't have college degrees. That's his base. And he's marketed to that base, and that base he's been marketed to in a very traditional, branded way. I'm Trump, trust me, I'm Trump. Trump will do what you want, and Trump is all about Trump. And that's the traditional way we've marketed our own brands. I've worked on Pantene shampoo, Olay beauty care, Citibank bank, Samsung electronics, the whole thing. We're the brand, trust us, buy us. And we identify our base and we sell hard to that base. If you think about it though, his base is declining. The number of white uneducated or white non-college degree American males has dropped off by about 10% since he was elected 4 years ago. So he's got a case of diminishing returns. He's got a case of diminishing community to actually talk to with that message. And he has got no ability to take that message to the other communities. Because it's not a message, it's a brand. It's here I am, trust me. Biden, on the other hand, is doing quite a crude version of next generation or next practice marketing. What he's trying to do is to get an argument to different communities, different micro communities, if you like, and an argument that sticks with each. Now, the argument that sticks on healthcare is a different argument and potentially a different community from the argument that he makes on green energy. Is a different one again that he makes when he when he talks about how he's going to generate the economy. When he talks about tax, he's talking to Wall Street. Different communities with different arguments. And he's trying to use different vehicles or different instruments to talk to those different communities to embed the arguments. But what he's doing is much more sophisticated, because we need to be much more sophisticated now, because the consumer's much more sophisticated, because knowledge is being democratized. So he's trying to say, here's the argument that's going to get you to do what I want you to do, vote for me. Here's the argument for you guys, here's the argument for you guys. Trump, the old brand model, I'm big, I'm Trump, trust me. And we're going to see it play out. And it's no different, really, from the way that marketing is progressing, I think, in this country.
How do brands make that decision? I mean, if you're a Samsung or an Apple and you take that Trump approach, how do you make the decision from switching from that to becoming a bit more tactical and looking at your consumer segments? When do you use one and when do you use the other?
I'm not sure I'd agree with the word tactical on that, because I think this is the strategic choice that organizations have to make now, that says, as a strategic choice, do we continue to thump away at the brand and make the brand the number one priority that we keep pushing? Or do we make a strategic choice that says we need to focus really hard on the community bases that we're interested in? And what are the community bases that are really going to give us the growth that we need? Because we've probably got, if you do any sort of cohort analysis on most of the organizations we work with, they've got anywhere between 6 to 12 cohorts that are quite easy to identify in terms of value to the organization. The most valuable cohorts are usually the ones that finance say, invest in them because if we lose them, we're dead. But marketers always say, but actually the most valuable ones to us are the ones who are so embedded with us that we should be focusing on the second tier opportunities. And that's where a strategic choice is taken that says, do we go after the low-hanging fruit from a growth community point of view so that we understand consumers and we influence consumers and we get consumers to understand our arguments, like Joe Biden, our arguments to buy us, and that's a different argument potentially across different groups, or do we thump away on a brand? Now, that's a stark, so I'm presenting it as a stark choice. It's an either or. It's not. It's a blend of the two. But the traditional way was to prioritize the brand and to think secondarily about how do you bring on for growth smaller community groups. With the diversity that we're facing into now, the challenges that we have right now, we need to reprioritize and rebalance. And I believe that the primary strategy is, how do you bring on micro communities? And they're not micro, they're your growth engines.
They're quite big. I mean, regional Australia, 8.8 million.
Yes.
Western Sydney, 2.3 million.
Yes.
They're big chunks.
And think about the language, if I may, the language you just used to talk about them. It's geo-specific language. It's rural, it's Western. It's not attitudinal. It's not propensity to bias. It's not culturally biased. And I think we need to be sophisticated. So again, to use my Biden-Trump analogy, Biden is doing the geo thing. He's running to Pennsylvania with a tale about how he's a poor kid from Scranton and how he empathizes with them. He's got Obama down in Florida saying, have tears that I'm not your president anymore, but I've got a good second guy who's Biden coming in. But they're doing it on a geo basis. And geo is why I call Biden's approach quite crude right now, because they haven't got the engines yet, and they haven't understood the sophistication of the engines yet. And they are available to us, and you guys have some of the best engines, I think, in the world right now, but nobody understands them yet because we don't have the sophistication as marketers to leverage them right now. But when you can communicate with a homogeneous group based on how they think, rather than what color their skin is, rather than where they live, rather than what they bought last month, which Amazon do, when you can do it on a propensity for how they think, then I think you're starting to get to a much more sophisticated way of growth through community management, but not community geo-set, community attitudinally set.
And if we talk a little bit about what these micro-communities could look like, so there are some geographic ones, so
correct.
Western Sydney, outer Melbourne, but partly that's because you've mentioned that as well, that the clusters, people move into clusters.
Yes.
Even in terms of over 60s that are moving up
Yes.
north coast, Queensland, for example, or certain areas around the country. So there is a geo flavour to that, but could be cultural, so non-English speaking background, students,
Yes.
tourists for those products that want to reach tourists and students. We've got, what would you say are some of the other micro-community clusters? How would you break that down?
Because there's geo, and then there's the needs-based. We need to sit with a community who are like us because they have the same needs for us. So if we eat a particular type of food or a particular cuisine, then the local grocery stores are in this locale and we can use them.
And it's kind of these three dimensions. It's also looking at these multi-dimensionally, not just single dimension or two-dimensional. And an example for me has always been millennials, and people say, oh, we want to reach millennials, and then they come up with some, really wacky creative and messaging. However, for me, Chinese millennial, second generation, or first generation versus an Indian millennial versus a second generation African, Kenyan millennial, the behaviors, attitudes are so different. Yes. And so for us, that's been really important, weaving in the cultural element throughout all of the segments, even over 65s. And we look at that starts at 60. And I've been just monitoring the content on that, and it's not very culturally biased, for example. No. And
it's very.
And I often think, how would my dad engage with this? With this?
And again, I think Rebecca Wilson has done a fantastic job with Starts at 60, and I believe it's now the largest online publishing platform. Wow. Didn't exist 5-6 years ago.
And she's done a great job in terms of putting an online shop, and the content-driven strategy is fantastic.
But then
I'm again, engaged as a under 65.
You traditionally go after the largest group you can get to get the business moving, which is a white over 60 community, without real consideration for the other pieces that you can add to that, the other cultural pieces that can be added into that. And that's, I guess, and I think this is where Rebecca will go with it next, because that's the growth opportunity. Is now we've got that group, now we've got that engine working, how do we start to blend in the success of other groups towards that, and how do we add to the texture of it all? But again, we're talking about things that are homogeneous on age rather than on location. I think that's a pretty good way to think about it. We were doing a project for an online trading business quite recently, and online trading, I think in Australia there's something like let me get the numbers right. There's about 80,000 people who trade online. Serious traders, not people who are looking after the stock market and doing 1 or 2 trades a month with ComSec. People who are trading 5, 6, 10, 20 times a day, and it's a profession to some of them, and it's an obsessive hobby to others of them, but it's generative of significant income for many of them. There's about 80,000 of them. That 80,000 group, when we looked at it, there was no homogeneity whatsoever in terms of skin color, religion, cultural background, geo-demo, socio. There was nothing that held these folks together. It was really quite a hard project for a marketing guy to look at, because how do you actually identify who the target customer is, and how do you understand if you're serving that customer correctly? Because our traditional engines and our traditional metrics for understanding that weren't applicable. The only thing that makes these people the same is their propensity for risk. It's the risk appetite.
Interesting.
And their risk appetite is they are prepared to take more risk with their family's wealth, with their own personal wealth, than the rest of the population do.
And access to the knowledge as well.
And access to the knowledge. And they're prepared to dedicate themselves to that. So what makes them different then from
you'd say financial literacy, some form of literacy, digital literacy.
But those are engines. Yeah. Those are things that fuel them. But if you're not prepared to take risk, you're not a potential customer of theirs. Yeah. So if you're a person who's prepared to take risk, you're a person who's probably wagering online. So my immediate question is, how many of the folks who are wagering online, who tend to be 20 to 35-year-old male, how many of them go on to become high-risk traders when they tip over the 35 mark and they find the same way to satisfy a need, which is a risk appetite need, but they do it on a different platform?
Or some form of addiction, but we won't go into that.
The stock market, is it wagering or not? Is wagering? But what I do is, I guess what I'm trying to identify is there's a homogeneity around risk appetite. What other attitudinal homogeneous areas can we reach? Now, we couldn't have these conversations 20 years ago. We didn't have the ability to access this. But with neuroscience, it's quite easy to see how people behave with the assimilation and the scrape that you can do on social media through behavior and how people think about behavior, what their behaviors manifest. You can start to identify these people through clustering. And that's where the next generation of marketing needs to start thinking about.
Do marketers have access to that data? I mean, that data exists on Google, Facebook, some of the marketing automation tools. It happens in, you know, when you see some of the experiments that are done on that neuroscience side of things, and you get to see brain scans and what areas of the brain light up. But do marketers have access to that kind of information on their customer base and their potential customer base?
For the marketers who are well-resourced, who have the knowledge that those groups are the potential for their success, I know there's really good work going on in that space. But that's top end of the curve. The middle of the curve right now is, how do you find homogeneity in growth areas that you currently don't have? So a lot of Australia has been marketing to the middle of the population, the white part of the population, without understanding that great growth opportunity exists if only they can extend themselves to understand 52% of this country who they're not currently thinking about. Now, which parts of that 52% are most relevant? They don't need to get into the sophistication of risk appetite and risk appetite appeal. They just need to get into the sophistication of how are these people living their lives, what's the same and what's different, and how do we get them to buy if they haven't bought us before? How do we get them to buy more if they've bought us once? How do we get them to come back to us if they've rejected us? How do we do that in low-hanging fruit opportunities that are growth opportunities that's being demanded of all of us as marketers that we haven't done before? How do we take steps into that? Because you can't risk the business. You can't risk your brand budget. How do you chunk off test and learns? How do you chunk off a portion of your budget to go and start experimenting with that? And that's where I come back to, Reg, and I'm not here to sell your business in any way, shape, or form. I think it's brilliant what you do. But it's a great first step for organizations to understand how they can start accessing communities, growth communities, that they haven't really been considering before. And I don't mean it in a way of, you know, the standard multicultural stuff. And I heard somebody talk about multicultural yesterday, and it drives me nuts when I hear this. When they talk about multicultural, that means they do language translation, doesn't it? And you just want to. Anyway, it's not about language translation. It's about insight. It's about customer behavior. It's about community homogeneity. It's about understanding what influences are, where the influences come from. It's about identification and using the right communication channels to get to them. Doesn't matter what language that's in. You're starting very much with an opportunity, which is a growth opportunity.
We did a study of about 2,000 of our ambassador panel, and 85% of them actually consume information from overseas, actually.
Yes.
So it's already in language. So the translation piece is such a minor part of it. And it's you know, information that they care about. It's mapped to their behavior. It's being referred to word of mouth within the community and being shared. There's just a whole engine, I think, which is one of the challenges for marketers. Is they're up against
but imagine,
brands that understand them.
Imagine you going into a marketer's office today and saying, I can get you 3% growth on your business if you know, for, let's just say, for sake of argument, for $50,000. And they're going to say, how are you going to do that, Reg? And you're going to say, well, actually, I'm going to spend that $50,000 in India, on social media networks in India. And that is so outside the realms of what they think is sensible, normal, traditional. But what you've just said is that the Indian community here is being influenced by social media channels that they're getting from
They're
the
watching
home country.
movies, Bollywood or Tamil movies from overseas. So the example of that is, and remittance companies have started to look at that,
Yes.
and they advertise with companies overseas. So ABS-CBN is the one in the Philippines
Yes.
that they advertise with, and then maybe Yup TV.
Yes.
Some of those providers that provide entertainment,
Yes.
the Netflix equivalents in language,
Yeah.
is where they are spending some dollars, but very few. I mean, Remittances 100% multicultural.
I remember when I was with Standard Chartered Bank, which I think is a fantastic organization understanding developing nations, developing cultures, invests there. We did a lot of really good work there. But I remember we're not going to name names. I remember one of the board members came to me. I was global CMO for Standard Chartered for a while. And he came to me and he said, we're doing this Liverpool football deal. He said, and I was watching the Liverpool game on the weekend. He said, but we'd put Chinese language up on the hoardings around Anfield football ground, and we're paying for that as Standard Chartered. David, what the hell are you playing at? It's in Britain, for God's sakes. The viewing population of Liverpool Football Club playing is much greater in China than it ever will be in Britain. And the affiliation that Chinese people have to see their own language associated with a club that they support and the brand that understands how to make that connectivity for them is the tip of the iceberg with access into how to get Chinese people influenced to get involved with Standard Chartered as a business. But it's that thinking that needs to be explored. It's that learning that needs to be shared. It's that insight into cultures and communities that are not as familiar to us that your organization does. And it does it in a way that, is end-to-end. I know you do the end-to-end stuff, but the value is the real insight that you have into how these communities operate and the strength of understanding that you've built up over 10, 15 years, the data that supplies that, and now the marketing tech that you've developed to allow you to access these communities very effectively. And it's not about whether they're onshore or offshore. It's actually how you influence them and how you influence them to do what it is that marketers haven't asked them to do before.
Yeah, beyond culture and into behaviours. Quick point on megatrends. I mean, we see that, in the marketing landscape, people talk about megatrends and they talk about fragmentation, localization, personalization. What's your take on those as the megatrends, and how do you think it applies to micro communities?
I sound a little bit like a broken record on all of this stuff, but I was very fortunate to be CMO of Bankwest in this country, 2007 to 2009. We grew that bank from the 15th largest in the country to 5th largest retail bank, and we did that in about a year. People have looked at that model and they've said that was extraordinary. It wasn't really extraordinary, we just did it differently. And what was different about us was, at that time, because it was the late 2000s, at that time everybody was doing the traditional big brand, one message, one mass model, and all we did was local area marketing. And we did local area, we would put up a store, and every time we put up a store, we would blitz the local community with, here's why this business is the right business for you to be involved with. So from a community level, if that was in an area like Chatswood, we made sure the insight, the language, the cultural work was all being done for the local community. If it was a CBD one, it was a different type of local area. But we were getting it up. We were using pinch points, we were using local area marketing, fragmentation, personalization, whatever you want to call that stuff. What we were doing is we were talking to the right groups at the right time, in the right way, with the right insight. And we were building a jigsaw from multiple pieces. And that's what micro community is. It's understanding what are the right communities for your business, how do you engage them through insight, and how do you piece them all together, building from the bottom up. That's quite different. It's a very different behavior. It's a very different approach to ask marketers to take, who for 20, 30 years have succeeded by doing it from the top down. One brand, one message, and how many people can I capture in one hit? It's very different. It requires the same intelligence, but it requires a very different approach. So my view on, we hear words like fragmentation, and it sounds like it's all falling apart. That's what fragmentation implies. Whereas one size fits all and scale.
I think of Sesame Street. Fraggle Rock.
It's good. But that's next practice for us. That's next practice. That's what next practice looks like. Is it's the sum of the parts rather than the single piece.
And where's segmentation? The word segment, you've talked about this before. Where is that at now?
Segmentation, I think, has to catch up. Within the last week, 2 weeks, I've heard people talk about archetypes. I've heard people talk about life stage modeling. These things were useful to us when we didn't have anything better. And if you go back 10, 15, 20 years, they were actually quite helpful because we were limited with our choices of communication channel. And we were going after the biggest size of the prize. So if there was 12 archetypes, how did you try and get 6 of them engaged with one message? But nobody's an archetype. They're the most two-dimensional structures. Segmentation on life stage, helix personas, all that sort of stuff. It's helpful, but it's not the level of sophistication that's needed to understand the business that we were working on, I was talking about earlier, which is, how do you understand the homogeneity of people who have a risk appetite? You can't find them through
Jungian archetypes.
You don't find them that way. You have to find different tools to find them.
Yeah.
And you have to have different expertise to find them. Does the information exist to find them? Yes, it does, because we have now 1 billion data points per person on social media right now. Do we have the sophistication of individuals and businesses? And there's some really excellent businesses out there who can help marketers define all of that for themselves. Yes, there is. So why aren't marketers doing it? One, we're not really that very risk averse. We have to deliver.
There's a lot of pressure
So there's a lot of pressure
fail.
to not do things that are different. There's also our own lack of our own education, our own expertise. So it's a big risk to actually take a step into that area because you're dealing with people who use words and phrases and concepts that you haven't dealt with in your last 20 years as a marketer. You're leading teams on a different journey and you're putting at risk your business. So we have to find ways to help people step through this. And stepping through it, again, is let's not go for massive sophistication on a business immediately. Let's do it in steps. Let's understand low-hanging fruit. Let's identify a whole bunch of different communities that could potentially give you business that you're not getting business from right now. And let's choose the 2 that we think are the most important. That could be a culturally based community. It could be a geocentric community. It could be an online aged-based community like Starts at 60. But you need to be led in doing that by people who know how to do it and who have done it. They need to have the expertise. It's people like you who understand the insight into those communities, who understand the ambassadors who operate within those communities, who have 10, 15 years of experience of communicating with those communities and getting business returns for doing so. And it's your ability to share that with marketers to help hold their hands to try and do things that they haven't done before. But we have to go through this as a gradual progression. Now, do we have the infrastructure and the agencies in place to do that? There's a lot of traditionalism in our industry, and a lot of the industry is under severe cost pressure and return on investment pressure if you're investing in creative agencies. They're very expensive beasts to invest in, and they used to be your primary source of building your brand and doing your work. They're not now. They're your secondary because the customer's more expensive, more important than your agency brand is, if you like, the brand that the agency is available for you. So we have to recalibrate. But the traditionalism says we can do that for you. and they can do some of that.
We saw this with COVID, and particularly in Victoria, but around the country, where you're forced to communicate to all of Australia, and it's essential
Yes.
when it comes to health or education or a pandemic. And we'd reached out a couple of times to some of the media agencies. They're like, "Well, we've got this covered."
Yes.
And then finally, we got an opportunity to work with the construction industry in Victoria through Master Builders Association.
Yes.
And we were able to get out in 16 languages, and it wasn't just the translation, it was actually the understanding of the construction workers, the Afghani tilers, the Chinese transport guys, and getting the message out, getting the message up on building sites, through social, through digital. And we ended up reaching about 230,000 construction-related individuals, including their families as well, because COVID was starting in the home and being taken onto building sites. And this was when they were moving from stage 4 to stage 3 restrictions. So it was a really great case study for us, but just it was interesting to look across the board and how the industry responded to COVID.
Because you know how to do it, and you know the different communities that need to be communicated to, and you know the different places that they're going to be receptive to the messages in. And that's a whole area of expertise that is absolutely essential to any marketing community right now. But you've got to recognize that it's not an area of expertise that they were using 5, 10, 15 years ago. So they have to start doing new things. How do we help them start doing new things? How do we help them understand that they need to manage the customer? They need to manage that community, those different types of community members that you were talking about.
So within the marketing structure, who should own the customer? Is it analytics? Is it strategy insights? Is it...
That's the question that I always avoid, mate. That is the question
Because somebody's got to...
I always try and avoid. It's a really difficult... Because what we're talking about today is growth. How do you grow a business? And marketing traditionally has been the function responsible for growth. But the customer experience now, if you're going to, traditionally you got growth through driving a brand, and you got driving a brand through television. One size catches as many as you can, and that's the way we did it. Growth now is, how do you focus on the customer? How do you get the customer experience right for your business? How do you make sure that the customer is buying more of you, and is definitely not leaving you, and is now becoming an advocate for you on the channels that they operate in? That's a very different approach from the marketing piece. And as the marketing piece, as the traditional brand piece, has become less involved in commerce, this piece of customer management has become increasingly more involved in the commerce and the long-term value of a customer, and the analytics that go behind that, and the finance translation of that into the commerce of a business. And that's new skill sets for some marketing people. We do a lot of breakfasts with a lot of marketing people who've asked the question you've just asked. And we say to them, if you want that job, don't worry about what the customer ownership job is called. Some organizations it'll be CMO, some it'll be Chief Customer Officer, some it'll be Chief Revenue Officer, some it'll be Chief Growth Officer. Whatever the title is, if you want that job, if your finance isn't of the highest quality, go back to school and get your finance courses done. If your commercial understanding of how to manage your business proposition to a profitable outcome, if you don't understand how to do that, go back and do your MBA. Because if your real skill set, and if your core skill set and expertise is building a brand, that's great, because you'll still need that. But you need these things as well. And you need to manage analysts, and you need to manage data science, and you need to manage the technical side of that if you want to be that role. Because that's the only thing that allows you to really understand the customer, and then to really leverage that customer understanding. And as we look across a lot of Australian businesses right now, some of them are starting to move there very well. Some of them are starting to move there very well, and there's some really, really excellent individuals in the marketplace who are very good at that stuff. I look at Steve Brennan, who's now at Zip, who was at Uber for a while, CMO of the year last year. Alex Meyer at The Iconic, I think, is brilliant at doing this. We have, I see the work that Shweta Mehra does at ANZ and the team of people that she's built to help do some of this work. There's some really brilliant people in the marketplace right now who can do this. But the rest of the marketplace is still making decisions as to, do I want to be a marketing communications specialist, or do I want to go on to be a customer management specialist, because they're different now. And if I want to be customer management, do I have the skill sets necessary to do that, which are commercial, financial, on top of all of the analytics and marketing stuff that we've had to do before. So it's not an easy question, and I think to come back to your question, what is that role and who owns it? It really depends on the size and scale of the organization and the importance of the customer to that organization at this point in time. So putting in a chief growth officer for a non-data rich business doesn't really make that much sense, because you don't need the analytics and you don't have the data to analyze anyway. So it's just a title, and you're going to be doing traditional brand marketing, which is the thing that's going to take you forward, which is a good thing. But if you're a data rich service business in insurance or wagering or banking or whatever else, it's a different role altogether. And we see that.
Super fascinating. Thanks, David, for coming in and doing the warm-up. So we're going to start in about 5 minutes.
I'll maybe be a bit more concise.